Welcome back to Media 7. I've been talking to the Minister of Broadcasting, Jonathan Coleman. We're joined now by three prominent voices on broadcasting policy. The head of the Christchurch Polytechnic Broadcasting School, Paul Norris, Senior Lecturer at the Unitec School of Communications, Peter Thompson, and broadcaster, author and media trainer, Brian Edwards. Welcome to you all. Now, Paul, perhaps I could start with you. You're one of those academics that the Minister has been quoted as saying needs to catch up with the play because the game has changed. What did you make of what you've just heard?
I see this policy actually as the first step in the demolition of genuine public broadcasting.
In what respect?
Well, I'm very concerned about the status of TVNZ under the Minister's policy. I mean, clearly it's still going to be a public broadcaster owned by the public, but it's not going to be doing any public broadcasting in a meaningful sense. If it is just a commercial broadcaster, just like all the other commercial broadcasters, then it will revert to behaving fully commercially, which means why should it run any children's programs? They're not commercial. Why should it run any minority programs like Attitude or Praise Be or something of that sort? It should surely, if you want it to be a fully commercial broadcaster, it should actually maximise its commercial profit, which is what we're hearing from other quarters of the government. So this is a serious state of affairs, because I don't believe that the New Zealand on-air system that the Minister has talked about, I don't think that's enough in itself, and I think the experience of the 90s, late 90s demonstrates that.
What's your response to that, Minister?
Well,
I mean, this is the same thing. If you can fund the programs, but who's going to screen them?
Look, TVNZ has been commercial for, forever, basically. And what you've got now, if we take that funding away, we make it competitive, TVNZ is still probably going to end up with the vast majority of that, but the bar's going to be set higher. TVNZ doesn't have the monopoly on good ideas. And quite frankly, the public out there, they don't care if they see their public broadcasting content on TVNZ, if they see it on TV3 or Maori television. There's a lot of choice out there. So you're wedded to this idea of a monolithic public broadcaster. I say you've got to be forward-looking, see the way the industry's going, accept that the economic conditions, don't permit us to have a fully funded public broadcaster.
I'm not talking about fully funding.
Well,
I'm talking
but see
about
that we've got this protected
charter.
funding. Well, the Charter's been an abject failure. Labor had 9 years in power. They weren't able to deliver on it.
Okay,
They've been rejected. We've got new ideas, and we're going to go about delivering
If there
them.
were problems with the Charter, and I agree that there were, then surely the trick is to deal with the problems, address the problems, but not throw the Charter away.
Well, this dual mandate was just unworkable for Labor, basically.
I can see you all nodding, actually.
There's no difference in the content on TVNZ before the Charter as opposed to after the Charter.
Now, let's actually take a show of hands. In favour of the Charter, our three panellists?
Well, yes, but I think here...
Always with the reservations.
I think here you have to be very careful about how you understand the failures of the Charter. I agree that it hasn't delivered fully on the full range of its public service remit, but there are very specific reasons for that. And one of the key reasons was, as Jonathan has pointed out, was that it was caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, trying to deliver a dividend to the government, and on the other hand, trying to deliver a very wide range of public service outcomes on the basis of $15 million a year. It was never going to be enough, and the political intrigues that underpinned the tensions between the Ministry for Culture and Heritage and the Treasury placed an absolutely impossible burden on TVNZ. Now, what Jonathan is supposing is that by making the fund contestable, that's going to relieve TVNZ of all these pressures. Well, it will, but as Paul correctly states, it's going to go back to a commercial basis of operation. And there's a fundamental problem with both the New Zealand on-air contestable funding model and the TVNZ funding model as it was, and that is that neither of them insulated programming decisions and scheduling decisions from commercial pressure. So they didn't actually alleviate the commercial failure, the market failures that they were intended to do so. And I'm afraid this current model that's being proposed is going to fall into exactly the same trap.
So what's the solution then? The fully funded, non-commercial public broadcaster. Would you support that, Brian?
Well, I would like that, but I agree with the Minister that that's
But you probably don't want to pay for it, do you?
You can't have that. I mean, I think that's quite true. What I want to know is what Jonathan means when he talks about quality stuff. Because my understanding is that what you might call the commercial imperatives and quality stuff, they just don't go together. It just doesn't work. And you see that particularly in the area of news and current affairs. What the commercial imperatives are all about is selling audiences to advertisers. That's what it's all about. And so what the broadcaster has to do is maximize that audience to the fullest extent. And that means giving us programs that are essentially absolutely populist in nature. You're not going to get that quality stuff under a system like that. You don't get it. Under that system, the news is just treated, and we see this in New Zealand already, we see this on television in New Zealand, as another program, another entertainment program that has to maximize the audience and therefore has to be as sensationalist as possible. It can't afford to devote any time to any issue because television networks are terrified of boring people. These two things don't go together, and they won't go together. And my view is that you're about to turn, I agree with these two, you're about to turn Television New Zealand into an entirely commercial enterprise. And it's a state broadcaster. It's called Television New Zealand. It surely has other obligations.
Well, look, I mean, TVNZ is 90% commercially funded as it is. I mean, 90% of it revenue comes from advertising. The point about these programs and whether they will be commercially viable, the point about the 15 million is that it's a subsidy for the programs so they will be viable for the broadcasters to compete for them and show them. So, you know, I mean, we live in a difficult world in terms of the pressures on media companies.
But it's not just a question, Jonathan, of whether they play these programs, it's the question of where they put them. And what we see at the moment is the programs that are designated as what you call quality stuff are marginalised on the networks into times when nobody can see them.
Well, I think then you start getting into the debate about what is quality, and we touched on that.
Well, I'd like your answer. What do you believe? What is a quality program?
Well, look, you know, as I say, one person's quality is another person's rubbish.
That's a you have a view on what is a quality program. What is a quality program?
Brian, I'm going to take you up on this because your definition of a quality program seemed terribly narrow to me. I mean, I'm guessing you don't watch Go Girls.
I'm not watching Go Girls, but I do watch programs like Boston Legal. What you're trying to say is I'm an elitist. I'm one of the biggest consumers of popular television entertainment you would find in New Zealand. I love it.
Because I don't think we can dismiss
the moment I'm getting chicken McNuggets and fries from most of the channels I watch, and I would like occasionally a more balanced diet.
Sure.
Under Jonathan's scheme, I'm not going to get that balanced diet.
No, and you're going to get a lot of gaps in the schedule. Like, for example, blue chip documentaries, the more serious end of the documentaries, political, historical, biographical type documentaries that take resource. And there's a cost to the broadcaster to screen these programs, even if they get some money from your 15 million in New Zealand. But the broadcaster has to make a contribution, and there's the opportunity cost of not running a cheapo reality TV
Welcome to the last 2 years, Paul. Broadcasters have been running in the other direction from documentaries, even where there is funding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to answer your question about at least one example of what quality programming could be, and where it'll be a gap under the system that the Minister is proposing. We won't see any more of those programs. And I disagree with the Minister that the Charter didn't have any impact. There were some very good programs screened in the early years of the Charter, some very good high-class documentaries in the Festival of New Zealand series.
Okay, that's one series. Look, I mean, philosophically, we disagree on this stuff, so we're never going to come to a consensus here.
Can I just make one point? There's an interesting point here, and that is, you see, a program which I love to watch is Hard Talk, which is on BBC World. It's a marvellous international interview program. And people would say, and I guess you would say, you can't put that on television in New Zealand at 8 o'clock at night because no one will watch it. The problem is we don't know whether people would watch these programs because they aren't played in these time slots.
I actually haven't said that at all. You know, I mean, I don't know why you're saying I would say that.
Okay, well, what do you mean by quality stuff?
Well, the point is, look, I can define what I think is quality.
That's what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I could list some specific examples of programs. I think, for instance, Agenda was a quality program. I accept
at 10 o'clock Sunday morning. Yes.
Well, I mean, I wasn't responsible for that. Go and speak to the last minister. You know, I mean, it was his policy that.
Are you intending to move it to a better slot, or to suggest it be moved to a better slot?
The point is, with this $15 million, it is going to fund some strictly defined content, and we're going to be making sure that it's put on at a good time. And I can tell you that I see these guys shaking their heads, but look, you guys don't think the broadcasters are going to compete for this funding.
They'll compete for the funding, but they won't compete for quality. That's the problem.
Look, I can tell you that once that money is available in this environment, if you think TVNZ is not going to be in there after it and they're going to hand it over to TV3, it's not going to happen.
Well, but you see what TVNZ has done to Agenda? Issue, Jonathan. It's decided it's a kind of bit too serious, so we take off the current front man and we put Paul Holmes in the new programme to front it. because I think that's saying we need to make this more palatable to the mass audience. So we'll put Paul in front of it to host
the TVNZ program.
No, but
there's another problem
decision.
here. There's another
Right.
problem here that's really quite important to point out, and this is the ecological impact on the entire broadcasting system of removing the TVNZ Charter. You're quite right, it's becoming an increasingly competitive commercial market. That's going to intensify considerably if you get rid of the TVNZ Charter and make it a state-owned enterprise again, because it will compete tooth and nail to maximise its revenue. The market failure
It's been doing that anyway. It's been competing tooth and nail for years and years and years.
Well,
Look,
it's going to intensify.
It's just been a failure.
It's going to intensify, and the problem is
external forces being brought to bear on TVNZ by the macro environment. That's what's intensifying it.
Listen, I agree with all of that.
Yeah.
The problem is that's going to reduce the public value of the funding when you put it into a commercial context, because you're going to need more and more of that money to overcome the opportunity costs for the broadcaster. Already, New Zealand On Air has put forward programme recommendations. It's earmarked funding for particular types of programmes, for example, children's drama. And even if the producers are willing to make it, the broadcasters aren't willing to show it because it disrupts the commercial schedule.
I want to move on from this because I think there's no chance of a reconciliation here. Actually, we'll go with Rick Ellis's statement. He said that TVNZ will be, quote, accelerating its strategy to transform the business from a traditional analogue advertising-reliant broadcaster to that of a multi-platform digital media company with diverse income streams. It sounds a little bit like we're getting out of television, Paul.
Well, I think we do have to move on, as the Minister has said. I mean, we can't just live in the past like that. And I actually think TVNZ is to be commended for the way it has actually seized upon digital opportunities. I mean, my belief is that a public broadcaster in any environment has to operate in the field of new media. It has to really engage in what I call the dispersal of its product. It is a version of inspiring on every screen. It's got to be attracting different audiences, different times, different places, and so forth. It's got to be everywhere, really. And I think TVNZ is intent upon doing that. My concern is that under a fully commercial model, it will not do all the things that otherwise could be done. That's really the problem.
Look, this $15 million is a fraction of the $375 million of revenue that TVNZ actually made last year. So you've got to put it into context. And as I said before, it has always been commercial. In terms of this quote from Rick Ellis, look, the jobs, 90 jobs going is not good. No one is happy about that. What's happened though, there's so much pressure across all media companies. TVNZ was going to have to make changes over the next 2 or 3 years anyway. It's just brought forward what was going to happen. So it's not an example of a broadcaster or a company that, look, but for the cyclical downturn, you know, these jobs would have been able to remain.
I'm not so sure about that, because when you look
as time went on, they were going to have to make these changes to adapt to the reality of
there aren't many private media
competing
companies. There are not many private media companies paying dividends this year. CBS has said it's not. The New York Times has said no dividends for the foreseeable future. Google's not paying dividends. Fairfax in Australia, and yet you're still prepared to take that $9 million from TVNZ?
Well, we actually have to clarify the point about the dividend, right? The government's got $200 million public money invested in TVNZ. At the start of the financial year, the government sets an expectation for the return on it. I mean, if you had $200 million in the bank, you wouldn't expect to get a zero return. So, and the government needs a certain amount of money to pay for schools, hospitals, the police, all the rest of it. At the end of the financial year, 2 months afterwards, the board bases their ability to pay a dividend on 70% net profit after tax. Now, the board actually decides whether they do that or not, but the expectation of the financial discipline up front is set by the government. But it's actually the board's decision whether they pay a dividend.
Well,
so there is a lot of confusion
it's a negotiation
there. They
with
actually
CC
think that at the start of the year, the government's saying this is what the dividend will be. It's actually not that.
There is a silver lining in all of this, though, isn't there? And
Thank God for that.
Yes, and that seems to be the programme we're on, which is part of TVNZ 7 and TVNZ 6.
Yep.
And at the moment, you're funding that for a period. I think 79 million or something like that has gone into that.
Yep.
That's TVNZ's money being paid back to it.
Okay, but what happened? But you've said that eventually you'd like to see these channels be self-supporting. That to me means they've got to have advertising on them.
Yeah, actually explain that, because I was puzzled by that.
Well, look, you know, one of the things we want to see is the switch over fully to digital, and I think once you've got all these TVNZ, once you've got analogue switch off, I think the viable future model will be for 1 and 2 to be the commercial engines that then allow 6 and 7 to put on quality public broadcasting.
Wait a
to
minute.
become self-sustaining in the long term.
If you can have a broadcasting system where the single institution has commercial channels and public service channels within its own body, then why not keep the charter and simply have TVNZ 6 and TVNZ 7 put on a broader network? You know, maybe carried on Sky, maybe eventually it'll go free to air on regular frequencies. You've actually undermined your own argument, because you said before that you couldn't have a commercial system and a public system in the same broadcaster. What you're pointing to now is precisely that.
I'm talking on those same channels. It just doesn't work. But look, the reality is the charter hasn't worked. I mean, you'd have to say there is no difference between
the implementation of the charter didn't work.
But why?
Why? Because it was a meaningless bunch of mission statements, and basically
that's not true.
It absolutely was. I mean, look, the test of it is what's on the screen.
Have you even read it?
Well, you can think I'm wrong, but it's opinion.
There's another interpretation here, Minister, and that is the reason that the dual mandate hasn't worked is because the government has not actually supported the public broadcasting element of the mandate.
Absolutely.
It's always insisted on...
And who was the government? The Labour
Well,
Party?
in part
we're not apologising for Labour.
In part, that's absolutely true. No, you're quite right.
Well, can I understand what you're saying here about this? Are you saying that the commercial wing, what you might call it, TV1, TV2, would subsidise or support what was happening on the non-commercial public service wing, which would be TVNZ
I think that's
6 and TV? That's what you're saying?
That's a potential long-term model.
Well, actually, there's another angle to that question as well.
Would that be that terrible, Brian?
That wouldn't be that terrible. Where are they going to get the money to do that?
But you'd also need some sort of charter in place to guide what 6 and 7 are actually doing. You need programming.
You guys are so obsessed with the charter.
Well, you need something.
We're obsessed
people
with
in the real world.
We're obsessed with the
about the charter.
This is the real world, Minister. Welcome to it.
No, you're in academia. The real world, I can tell you,
We're in academia.
Yes. Hey, look,
well, you're not.
Anyway,
I can tell you.
But I was.
I can tell you, no one comes into my lecture office to complain about broadcasting regulation.
I don't suppose anyone goes into Bill English's office to complain about the balance of trade. It doesn't mean it's not important.
Well, no, they come in and they talk each day about the things that really do affect their daily lives. I mean, this is a side track we could go down, but look, the reality is the charter hasn't delivered for ordinary New Zealanders. The people are viewing this stuff.
Wait a moment. I have an actual
because
question.
It was useless. Yeah.
I have an actual question rather than a statement of faith.
I forgot you were here.
Yes. We've talked about the 6 and 7 carrying the public service obligation. Does that mean they will be eligible for this $15 million of what was charter funding? Because we don't qualify in terms of audience
reach. He's concerned about his salary.
Look,
you understand, Jonathan?
It probably is. Look, that model will not work until you've got that ubiquitous platform and analogue's been switched off, because at the moment it's for free-to-air broadcasters, and 6 and 7 is just available on Freeview. So, but I see this is why I think the emphasis on the policy has to be to move towards digital switch on, analogue switch off, whatever you want to call it, as soon as possible.
Because you need Freeview to work, don't you? You really need Freeview to work, because you've got this 2012 date. You need to free up all that spectrum.
Well, and I think the way to get it to work is to get digital switch
just
on.
to have compelling programming on it, surely.
Well, yeah, no, you didn't go down that way.
Are you familiar with Lord Reith, who I think was the first Director General of the BBC, and his famous dictum that television...
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, this guy reckons it's out of date, but I actually think it's
still
very applicable when you look at broadcasting.
I would have thought that the state broadcaster had an obligation to inform the electorate.
Yep.
Because you said at one point people aren't concerned about these things. I think people are concerned about these things, and I think there's actually an issue that has to do with democracy here, that if we aren't getting the sort of reasonable coverage of social and political issues on television that people deserve, then you end up with an uninformed electorate. And I think that's what we have at the moment.
Look, I actually don't disagree with you. And this is when I'm talking about what this 15
Maybe I'm
million...
wrong.
Well, no, okay, so if I agree with you, you must be wrong. But look, my view on what I'd like to see this 15 million achieve is to inform, entertain and educate. And I know that in your writings, you guys say, well, actually public broadcasting, it's more about market failure or meeting social, cultural
And
needs.
democratic
And I think when you look at what
here.
meets the needs of the majority of the population, I want this 15 million to go into stuff that 90% of the people could say, well, look, I may not necessarily want to watch it, although I'd hope they would, but I can agree that this is public broadcasting because it informs,
And
educates and entertains.
That's good.
At what time?
Well, I want it to be on
I mean,
at
in
a
terms
decent
of television time slots, at
No,
what
quite
time?
seriously, I want it to be on in prime time. Now, you know, you guys think it can't be done,
we do.
but
Well,
yeah, I know
there's
you
an
don't,
opportunity
but
cost to
that's
the
what I want to
broadcasters.
see happen.
We would love to see that happen as well.
I am going to have to ask you gentlemen to take it to the bar because we do have to move on.
Yeah.
But I think we got somewhere with that. Thank you to Jonathan Coleman, Paul Norris, Peter Thompson and Brian Edwards. Now, these are hard times for media culture, but as Sarah Daniel notes in this week's Take 2, culture has flourished in tough times before, with a little help.
Free radical Kiwi artist Len Lai, 1935. The world was in the grip of a Great Depression, but for Lai, poverty was the spur to creativity.
And then when you find a piece of steel, you might go like this with it, you know, and roll it about and so on, and you gradually get the grip of an idea.
He was the master of kinetic sculpture and experimental filmmaking. A maverick who almost unbelievably was hired to make commercials for the British General Post Office. Hang on, an archaic outfit like the Post Office with its own film unit in the midst of a Great Depression. Len Lai painted colour onto celluloid film. He created a psychedelic PR campaign for the Post Office Savings Bank set to Cuban riffs. The result was public service filmmaking at its most experimental.
Post Office Savings Bank puts a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for you.
It's a sober reminder, not just of the importance of penny pinching, but also of losing sight of the bottom line for just a few moments to give creative genius a free hand.
Sarah Daniel there. We'll take a break now, and when we return, it's the horse racing media and moral panic. And yes, those are two separate stories.